One way to begin studying the Bible as literature is for me to put up all the dates and kind of an outline and give you an overview. And that would be a good way to do it. But that's not the way I want to do it. I want to start with something very small. In fact, in a way, I want to start with a particular sentence. We might spend the whole class period on that sentence. And I don't even want to start with that exactly. I want to start with a thought poem. But here's the sentence I'm interested in. It's this one. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the earth. That's the first sentence. I mean, if we didn't know anything about the Bible, if we made no assumptions about the Bible, that's the first sentence we would read. And my question, this is a rhetorical question for now. It's the question I want to ask through this period and throughout the class, is what kind of writing does Genesis say it is? And then the second question, what kind of writing do you assume it is? And there's actually an answer to the question, what kind of writing does Genesis say it is? What kind of writing does it actually say? And in some ways what I'm interested in is the space before the sentence. The gap before the sentence. In a way, everything depends on that gap. But here's the thought poem, and we're playing around with attendance and how to take attendance. We're going to be taking attendance. We're just trying to figure out exactly what the best approach would be. But for today, we're probably not going to stick to this. We're going to ask you to turn this in. And if you would like us to read it, if you would like Emily to read it, I say us in the broad sense, Emily to read it, just put please read on it. And we're not going to grade these yet. This is still just kind of getting to know you. But please turn it in, all of you today, and that's how we'll take attendance, because we won't have time to actually take roll. Do you see any words forming there on that page? Oh, yeah. Yeah, let's see what we're doing here. Be sure to put your name at the top. That's not what I want. Don't look at that. Well, for some reason, so I'll just read it to you, okay? Put your name at the top, put the date at the top, and we'll just be turning them all in. We're going to work out some system with folders or something, all right? Okay. Here's the first question. Here's how I want to approach that one sentence. Not only we're not going to do a lot of background and a lot of dates and so on, and not only we're not going to talk about that, we're just going to talk about the first sentence, we're not going to talk about it right away. We're going to come at it from an angle. What's your favorite movie? Right? It's a complete sentence. My favorite movie is, aside from Apollo 13, which is the best movie ever made. Apollo 13 is the best movie ever made. So my favorite movie is, write it down quickly.
Independence Day is pretty good too.
Yeah, it is, yeah. Okay, you got that? Second question. And again, answer these questions very quickly. When in doubt, lower your standards. We're not grading on punctuation. This is a free write. Not grading on grammar. It's a free write. Just take a movie of your mind. Remember, if you don't capture your thinking here, once we start grading these, you can choose not to turn it in. Or if you turn it in, you can choose to have a conversation with us. So this is just kind of a starter in a way. All right? Something you think is true about life. Something you think is true about life.
You need to write down that second.
No, just write down what I think is true about life is. Get enough sleep and drink plenty of fluids, or whatever it is. Eat well and serve. I don't know, whatever you think is true about life. Something you think is true about life, big or small. So question number 3. In question number 2, what do you mean by truth? Or In what way is that sentence true? That's easy. So 3 sentences so far. Your favorite movie is something you think is true about life. Third, what do you mean by truth? Number 4. This is kind of a repetition from last time, but it's deliberate. The last book you read and when. It's not exactly the same question, but the last book you read all the way through and when. I'm not going to make fun of you, I promise. At least not to your face, at least not in front of you. I will post these on my website. No. The last book you read and when, and if you can't remember, say that. 5th question, and final question. What kind of writing do you think the first chapter of Genesis is? What kind of writing do you think the first chapter of Genesis is? You had to give it a label, right? You go and you look for music, hip hop or new age, or you got your remote with your TV, or you're looking at Netflix, you're browsing, right? Documentary, romance, adventure.
Are you talking like the first, like, recorded?
Just the first chapter, yeah, the first chapter of Genesis. Maybe you haven't thought about it consciously, but okay. And now I want you to go back and give this a title as if it holds together, as if it is a poem, and it's cheating to say untitled number 2. You could call it The Meaning of Life. You could call it Why Apollo 13 is the Greatest Movie Ever Made. Hold on to that. Be sure your name is on it. If you want Emily to read it, just say, please read. Now, there's a big word. I wish I, again, had more board space. There's a big word that I want to explore, and that's the word genre. Can you all see that? G-E-N-R-E, genre. Kind or type of something. In this case, kind or type of literature, kind or type of writing. That's why I asked you about your favorite movies.
Are we passing the board now?
Hold on to them for a little while, just a little while. Just the ruffling of paper, What's one of your favorite movie besides Apollo 13? Interstellar, okay. So we got Interstellar, what else?
Alice in Wonderland.
Alice in Wonderland, Interstellar, Alice in Wonderland, okay.
Point Break from 1995.
Wow, that goes way back. Point Break.
The Breakfast Club.
The Breakfast Club. Okay, let's just take those 4. What are anybody going to say Fight Club? Fight Club, that's usually one. So we've got, I already forgot, Interstellar, Point Break, Breakfast Club, Alice in Wonderland. If you were to group those 4 movies, how would you group them? Do they all belong in the same category? So how would you categorize them? Alice in Wonderland and Point Break.
Movies.
They're movies, okay, all right. Specific kinds of movies? Where would they be in the Netflix browser? Action, maybe? Suspense. Alice in Wonderland would be animation, maybe, okay. Breakfast Club? Classic, okay. That's an interesting word, classic. We want to talk about that word at some point too. Let's take these 2 movies, two of my favorite movies, Apollo 13 and Lord of the Rings. How would you describe the differences between the kind of movie this one is and that one is? Yeah, please.
Apollo 13 is more historical.
Okay.
It's something that was based on a true event.
Okay.
Lord of the Rings is completely fictional.
Okay, completely fictional. Okay, that's good. That's kind of, you might call it a fairy tale. Tolkien himself called it a fairy tale, although he thought it was a fairy tale for adults. He thought fairy tales were for adults. How would you know? I mean, we know that, right? And you're of course right. How would you know that Apollo 13 invites us to read it as in some way historical? You know, it's based on one of the actual Apollo events. There are people who don't believe the Apollo moon landings actually happened, and of course Apollo 13 wasn't a landing. They didn't make it. But how would you know that movie wants you to read it as historical? Yeah, please. Okay, at the very beginning, it's sometimes the way genre is identified is that it's based on there's an actual tag. And it works that way in the Bible too. Remember, the word Bible means anthology, or it means library. So there are lots of different kinds of writing in the Bible, just like there are lots of different kinds of movies, lots of different kinds of music. And sometimes it's identified. Jesus told the following parable. Parable is a kind of writing. It's a genre. We'll talk about parable later. And sometimes when you watch a movie, you can tell because it says, now they could be lying, right? They could be lying, but they're inviting you to read it as an historical event. How does Lord of the Rings begin? Do you recall? Okay, it kind of, or sort of like Star Wars too, long, long ago, far, far away. And there are signals with the kind of music there is, the kind of font that is used at the beginning with the titles, the lighting, same with Apollo 13, even if we didn't have based on a true story. And of course, we have knowledge of the events. We have, Yeah. Which of those two movies is true? Which of those two movies is true? Yeah, please.
Neither, because it's not completely true.
Okay, so truth in that sense means?
Like what exactly happened.
Okay, so truth means what actually happened. Okay, and we know that Apollo 13, I happen to be kind of a space buff. I grew up wanting to be an astronaut until I discovered I was afraid of heights, I'm bad at math, my vision's not very good, I'm claustrophobic. Left-handed, not very coordinated. I am the right height for an astronaut in the old days. Before there were women, those were the days when the men were there and the women just admired them. That was the way it should have been. Forever. What was I talking about before I started talking about that?
What's truth?
What's truth, right. And I happen to know that Ron Howard, who's my age too, we share, Ron Howard and I have a lot in common. He was Opie in the Andy Griffith Show. He took liberties with things. I mean, he took things that had happened on an earlier mission and compressed them. He left things out. He invented some scenes. So it's based on a true story. Could you make the argument, would you make the argument that they're both true? And if so, how? Anybody make that argument? Jared, looks like you want to make that argument. You don't want to?
Kind of. Like, there are themes that hold true to real life. Like in Lord of the Rings, like going on an epic journey, you could relate that to your own life, and essentially you're on your own hero's quest.
There you go.
You had adversity, and you have to overcome that adversity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't know if you heard Jared, but he's saying that there's a hero's quest in Lord of the Rings, and you have to face adversity, and the theme is you have to give up power. The small become the big. In some ways, it's exactly the same thing as Apollo 13, which is really based on remember the lunar module is called Odyssey, or was it the command module? Can't remember. So invoking Homer, you could say that the theme of both is that sometimes excrement occurs, things happen, and you have to deal with loss. That in order to become a hero, you could say, you have to suffer. Well, you see the kind of thing I'm doing. Sometimes things are labeled in a newspaper, editorial, or there's the front page. My mic just fell down. we know that certain things are on the front page, and then they're cartoons, or they're ads, and sometimes the way they're represented graphically indicates. But even when things are not labeled, there are different kinds of things. Pass the salt, please. I love you. Which of those two statements is true? How do we know that? Last night I had a dream in which I killed somebody. I killed somebody. What's the difference between those two statements? It's almost implicit in the language. When you go into a library, this is about a bookstore, but the same idea. When you go into a library, you don't say, I'd like a book, please. Right? It's you want a book in a certain theme. And then the next question is this why we have the Library of Congress classification system? You want history? Do you want geography? Do you want... let me give you a really good example of how the Bible, this is in a way a simple notion. Here are 4 pieces of text completely out of context from different parts of the first 5 books of the Bible. The first 5 books of the Bible are called the Pentateuch. The Pentateuch, which means the 5 scrolls. Genesis is the first. Yep, I think I can. Whoops. If that's not the spelling, it's close to the spelling, and I have the real spelling on a slide. Pentateuch. Does anybody know for sure if that's how you spell it? It's Pentateuch. It means the 5 scrolls. And look, we can just look at this and without necessarily none of these are labeled, right? There's nothing like based on a true story, or this is a fairy tale, but we can kind of tell, even thousands of years later. So here I've got 4 categories. 4 genres, you might say, kinds of writing. Folktale, court history, blessing, law. Might have other names. And I think we can line them up pretty easily, right? Even though they're not labeled. And this just suggests there are a variety of different kinds of writing in the Bible. When you go into the Bible, you're dealing with different kinds of writing. For example, look at the Lord bless you and keep you. If we had the full quotation from there, you'd see there are line breaks. There are line breaks. It's arranged as a poem, like the Psalms are arranged as poetry. There are line breaks. That's a visual indication that you're looking at something a little different, right? So, the Lord bless you and keep you, folktale, court history, blessing, law. It's obvious, isn't it? It's a blessing. Because it's in the grammar. It's in grammar itself and language itself. There are different kinds of writing, different kinds of mental operations. Just keep track of all the language that you have used in the last day, or all the things you've texted. I bet you could categorize. If you're in the sciences, you know about taxonomy. If you're a biology major, there's a biology major here. Taxonomies, put things in different categories. You do that with their language too. And some of that's built into the grammar, like a question. Do you know the way to the bathroom? Versus go to the bathroom, or I went to the bathroom. Whoever curses his mother or father shall be put to death. It's a law, those were the days. That's part of the covenant code. We're going to be looking at it. It's in the book of Exodus. And it's a law. I mean, it's just obvious that it's a law. Here's the third one. When the ass saw the angel of the Lord, when the donkey saw the angel of the Lord there, she cowered under Balaam character. So in anger, he again beat the ass with his stick. But now the Lord opened the mouth of the ass, and she asked Balaam, what have I done to you that you should beat me these 3 times? Am I not your own beast? Then the Lord removed the veil from Balaam's eyes so that he too saw the angel standing on the road with sword drawn, and he fell on his knees. Is that a history or is that a folktale? Now, why do you think that? It doesn't say it's a folktale. Don't you think that animals talk? Don't you think that... Have you ever had a border collie? I had a border collie with a huge vocabulary. She could understand me. She couldn't necessarily speak. But yeah, please, go ahead.
That's usually one of the indicators why I thought it was a folktale, was because an animal spoke.
Okay. Usually when you have talking animals, for example, in chapter 3 of Genesis, we have a talking snake. Is that you're in a kind of writing that's closer to Lord of the Rings or Alice in Wonderland than Apollo 13. Right? What else might identify that as a folktale? Talking, I mean, I'm an English professor, I'm a professor, I know lots of talking asses. Don't you think that miracles can happen? Don't you think that angels? Are you saying the Bible isn't true? There's untrue things in the Bible? I know you did. I was back there in the back, I'm saying, you know, I'm taking all kinds of things out of context, and you all have much more sophisticated notions of truth, but usually when we use the word true, we mean true only in the historical sense. And part of what it means to read the Bible as literature is to get a sense of genre, that not everything is intended to be read as history. We don't know for sure because it doesn't identify itself, but there seem to be different kinds of writing. And the assumptions you make about genre determine the sort of questions you ask. And what about this one? David reigned over all of Israel. By the way, this is in threes. That's another. How many times did my woman who walked on the water in the first day of class, how many times did she protest? 3 times. A priest, a rabbi, and a minister walk into a bar. It's usually in threes. Usually in threes. And that's how many times the ass refuses. But obviously this is court history. David reigned over all Israel, judging and administering justice to all these people. Joab, son of Zeruiah, was the commander of the army. Jehoshaphat, son of Ahilud. I mean, one of the ways you know it's court history, even if it doesn't say it's court history, is that you've got a lot of hard to pronounce names in it. And it's not rhythmic. And it's just kind of listy. It's got a different feel. It's got a different quality. So to say that there are different kinds of writing in the Bible is not to say that there aren't genres in the Bible that invite us to read them as history. That's obviously the case. Now, I'm not saying that that is historical. It could be completely made up. I'm just saying it invites us to read it as history. This is not a course in the, although we'll touch on history, it's not a course in the historical background or archaeology behind the Bible. That would be really interesting and really useful, but we don't have a way to, sort of deal with that. I'll talk a little bit about history. We're going to focus more on the texts. But what I'm trying to say is that there's a kind of writing that invites us to read it in certain ways, and then there's a kind of writing that invites us to read it in another way. And we can often get mixed up. It's as if we're playing different games. This is another cartoon. I don't know if you can see the caption. There's your problem, right? Here's a picture of throwing a football. Sometimes we can assume that something is intended to be read as history or science when it isn't. Or it should be read as history or science, or it isn't, because that's the assumption that most people make. Now, what's the answer to the question, what does Genesis say that it is? There's an objective answer to it. It doesn't say. It doesn't say, this is like Apollo 13. This is based on a true story. It doesn't say that. It also doesn't say that it's a fairy tale or a folk tale. It doesn't say that. It doesn't say it's a law. And if you've never read the Bible before, you think, wait a minute, where are all the sermons? Where are all the laws? They don't come right away, and I think that's really important. We do get them, don't worry, they're there. And they're really, really important. But we don't get them right away. We get these stories. But the text doesn't say. Yeah, please.
That's it. I know this is true for the Ark, and I forget if it's true for Genesis, but there are 2 stories of creation in Genesis.
Don't ruin my punchline, man.
Okay.
Yeah, you got to hold back on that. You don't know too much. You got to wait until... Jared is raising the issue of multiple sources, and we're going to be talking about multiple sources in actually next class period. No, that's a very smart comment. That's a really good comment. I'm going to call, because the Bible's literature calls the first few chapters, about the first 11 chapters of Genesis, myth. And by the way, books of the Bible are not sort of uniformly one genre or another. That's not, I mean, a single book of the Bible could have multiple genres in it, and Genesis is an example of that. For example, there are subgenres like genealogies, lists of who begat whom and so on. There are laws in the book of Exodus. There's a lot of stories, but there are also laws and so on. There are lots of different genres. But this is what most scholars call myth. Now, the word myth, yeah, first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis is myth. Now, that word is a problematic word outside of this classroom, right? If I say it's a myth the Beavers are going to have a good season, I mean they're not going to have a good season. Or it's a myth that OSU is a good school, or if it's it's a myth that this is a good class, or whatever. That means false, because our cultural assumptions are that what's true is what's historically true, right? But in this class, within the Bible as literature, myth, and I'm not making this up, this comes from somewhere, has a very, very specific definition. It means a story that uses symbols. This is my summary of a famous scholar, Margaret Ralph, who wrote a book called And God Said What, a book I like very, very much, and I've stolen lots of things from. A story that uses symbols to describe a reality beyond all language. So a reality beyond all language. Now, just have you absorb that for a minute. Why do scholars call it a myth? Because it looks like a myth, it sounds like a myth. They've read all kinds of myths. Right? How do you know that Apollo 13 is meant to be sort of non-fictional and Lord of the Rings meant to be fairy tale? In part because you've watched lots of movies, and you've seen lots of non-fictional movies. There are lots of them. And you've seen lots of fairy tales. So you have some knowledge of this. So they come to this. It doesn't identify itself as myth. It doesn't say the following is myth. But it begins in the beginning, once upon a time. It has the structure of myth. It has the feel of myth. A story that uses symbols to describe a reality beyond all language. Why call it myth? Because it seems to behave like myth, and because lots of really smart people have said that over the generations. Yeah, please, sir.
Then what's the difference between a myth and a legend?
See, now you're stealing my thunder again. You're just like Jared. We're going to be talking about that in a little while too. Yeah, that's really smart. You guys are too smart for it. Am I going too slow? You're way ahead of me. The short answer is a legend is like a myth with some possible reference to history. So it changes the question. The question becomes, if we say the Bible is a myth, and this is exactly what the Bible's literature is about in all the genres, even in history, because in the ancient world, when ancient historians wrote history, their standards for history were very different than ours. There's lots of history in the Bible. And the historical component of Judaism and Christianity is hugely important, right? I mean, the problem when you use the word myth is there's pushback in our age because we tend to bifurcate things. We tend to put things in binaries. Well, that means you're saying it's not true. It's just subjective. We're engineers. We want hard facts, and you're just a poet kind of thing. And we don't want to do that. Called Bible literature is to call it fuzzy or soft or gooey or whatever, and we don't want that. And particularly if we're believers or we respect the Bible, there's an understandable impulse to want to defend it on historical grounds. But it changes the question. We're not asking what did this really happen. It's what might this language imply about what these people believed about the nature of religious experience. That's how it changes the question. And it becomes a question we can all talk about, right? Might, and here's the notion of imply, takeaway. Remember the phrase takeaway from that cartoon on the first day. These cartoons I have a series of cartoons I show you, and they're related to key ideas in a sequence. That is, it's not stated about what these people believed about the nature of religious experience. Which of these three statements is true? I was married June 12, 1977. I love my wife. My love is a red, red rose. So how many of you would say number one is true? Raise your hands. It's actually untrue. I was married June 12, 1976. But it invites you to read it as what? No. As historical. I love my wife. How many of you would say that's true? Now, how can I prove? Those of you you don't think I love my wife? I mean, obviously what I'm trying to suggest is they're all true in different ways. And I'm trying to get you to be aware that when you say true, right, in this culture, without thinking about it, And there are historical reasons for this having to do with the rise of science, and all praise for science. All praise for biology, all praise for engineering. The assumption is that there's only one kind of truth. Even if you're not conscious of it being formed that way. Or, my love is a red, red rose. How many of you think that's true? I think it's really true. My love has thorns. My love changes. My love used to have red hair. Now it's kind of white. I used to have brown hair. My love is beautiful. My love is fragile sometimes. Different kinds of truth. How would you prove my love is a red, red rose? How would you prove I love my wife? You could prove I was married June 12, 1977. My answer to this question, and you can choose, you can make your own choice about truth. I'm trying to suggest something right from the very beginning about reading the Bible as literature, Bible from a literary point of view. And that is that when we talk about truth from the Bible as literature perspective, we're talking about different kinds of truth. Not true versus false. There's a wide variety of options. And the majority of Christians and Jews who ever lived accepted that, and the majority of Christian Jews and Jews alive today have accepted that. That is in a sense, the bottom line is I'm saying that in the Bible as literature, we don't read the Bible literally. We take it absolutely seriously, but we don't read it literally, and the majority of Christians and Jews over time didn't, and the majority of Christians and Jews alive today don't. That doesn't mean that the minority who do are wrong or stupid or don't belong in this class or don't have great insight or aren't spiritual and holy people, potentially. Or not spiritual and holy people, depending. It means that they have made assumptions about the nature of what is true, consciously or unconsciously. This is a little kind of bumper sticker. I like this. This is a good tweet. And this is actually Galileo Galilei. I don't know if you know this famous story in the 17th century. Galileo was, and this is actually the moment where sometimes it's called the disassociation of sensibility happened, where suddenly subjective and objective truth were split. Before that, if you would ask an educated person, is that literally true? They'd say yes. And they'd say, is that symbolically true? They'd say yes. They would make the distinction. By the way, do you notice the word literally? Think about the word literally. He literally blew his stack. His head is gone. He's literally on fire. Did you call the fire department? When we use the word literally, I heard the word literally 3 times this morning. He was literally crazy, somebody said. When we use the word literally, we almost always mean figuratively. It means the opposite. Isn't that interesting? Even words themselves have these openings, these holes in them, and it's quite wonderful. But what Galileo observed the moons of Jupiter and deduced, along with Copernicus and others, that the Earth revolved around the sun, not the sun around the Earth. And there are a number of people in the church who were fine with that, who didn't have any trouble with that. But there were some who did, including the person who was then Pope. And Galileo was censured. But he was quoted as saying by a cardinal, that is, a leader of the church, somebody who thought this was cool, good, right. The Bible tells us how to go to heaven, not how the heavens go. You see? So, in a way, what I'm getting at is what myth prepares us for, looking at the first 11 chapters, is it prepares us for thematic analysis. Just like some of you said that the Lord of the Rings, Jared said, right? Jared said that's a hero's quest and so on. I think the Lord of the Rings is profoundly true on a psychological, but if you're looking at it and you make that mistake, you think, wait a minute, hobbits don't have feet that big, or elves aren't tall, and they don't look like Orlando Bloom or whatever. It's not, you're responding to, you're playing the wrong game. You're asking the wrong question. Do we know for sure that it's not intended to be read as history? No, we don't. Why do we assume that? Because it sure looks like myth, it sure feels like myth, it sure acts like myth. Most people down the centuries have suggested that. And it yields a better conversation, not debate. Somebody's telling me about her boyfriend wants her to take this class so that they can debate the Bible. Well, what if there's some other things to do besides debate it? So, for example, what this means, let's jump a little bit. This is what it means to read the Bible as literally. What meaning might this imply, for example, to someone who is in crisis right now? One way to get this is to say, okay, what might this say to somebody right now? Now that's a somewhat different move than what might these people back then have thought. We want to be careful not to read our own values back. And then God said, let there be light, and there was light. And God saw the light was good. So what myth allows us to do is say, okay, wait a minute. Is light stronger than darkness? Is that true? I don't know, sometimes it doesn't feel like it. I'm talking to somebody right now whose father just committed suicide. Is light stronger than darkness? You'd sure like to believe that. Is that true or not true? What's the truth there? What's the claim that's being made? Now, people can deal with these issues in all kinds of ways. They can make other assumptions about what's true or not true. But you see how it works, right? You're looking and you think, now it might mean that. Notice it might. Or here's another one. This is from the first chapter. So, this very famous passage, chapter 1, verse 27. What's the gender of God? We have the assumption that the Bible only describes God using masculine images, and that's not true. Most of the images are masculine, but there's a very, very strong thread in both the Hebrew Scriptures and the Christian New Testament of seeing God as feminine. But in this passage, it's called in Latin, this is not the name that's in the text, but it's called this the Imago Dei, in the image and likeness of God. This is chapter 1, verse 27. God created humankind in His image. In the image of God, He created them. Male and female, He created them. Male, unnamed, female, not named. In His image, so there's a feminine quality to God. Again, we haven't gotten to chapter 2 yet. We're just looking at it for the first time. I mean, that's interesting, the Imago Dei. Or the larger question is, is this true? Are we made in the image and likeness of God? I guess it depends on what you mean by God. Versus, did Adam and Eve have belly buttons? Or the issue of the environment. There's an assumption that's often made that Hebrew Scripture and Christian Scripture are intrinsically anti-environmentalist. Well, here's a passage. God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill. This is a really important passage, and subdue it. It's right after the Imago Dei passage. And have dominion over, dominion. But then here's this passage at the end of the first chapter of Genesis, and I'm not making fun of this, but did you know that the first people before the flood in the Genesis narrative are vegetarian? And so are the animals. It's where the lion lays down with the lamb. Because to every beast of the earth and to every bird of the air and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I've given every green plant for food. There's no agriculture yet in this first creation story. I don't know, there's some interesting issues here. Or another thing that happens is we start paying attention to, rhythm. So what the Bible's literature is about, this first chapter, we haven't gotten very far, but in a way we've gotten a great distance. Because I'm trying to suggest how the Bible as literature begins right away by turning some of our assumptions upside down, or by showing us that that's what we're doing, we're making assumptions. Now, I'm making assumptions too. I'm trying to show you other possible assumptions and have you understand them. I mean, there's an objective truth here. If I asked you let me ask you, how would you construct a question for a Scantron exam based on what I've been telling you right now? Give me the Bible should be read as a myth, true or false. Is that a fair question? The Bible says it should be read as myth, true or false? false? That's a fair question. It doesn't say it. I'm suggesting it should be for various reasons. Or is this a scantronable question? The only things that are true are things that can be measured and weighed. No. You see, I mean, the Scantron exams kind of put us back on sort of standard ground. Anyway, they also help us to pay attention to the language itself. It clears us away. In a way, we're standing in front of the text, not behind the text. Wait a minute, what happened behind the text? I find that people really want to go behind the text and see what happened in the old days, in the ancient times. Or they want to go in front of the text and talk about all the jerk faces they know who are, right-wing, nut jobs or something, and how terrible it is. They want to talk about the guy out in the quad who's saying repent or burn. And what's hard is to hold our attention on the text because in a funny way, there's not very much there. I mean, in another way, it's profound what's there and what isn't there. There's very little language there. But here are two terms I'm going to want you to know because they have to do with rhythm. One is parataxis, which means coordination. The other is hypotaxis, which means subordination. We pay attention to rhythm. Parataxis just means and. You want to sound like the Bible? He came into class, and he forgot to introduce the two filmers. Did I introduce Jacob and Doug? And people wondered what was going on, and they didn't really care, and it got hot again, and he was just really brilliant, and nobody was paying attention, and whatever, and. And then he saw it was all pointless, and he left. Or no, then he saw it was all good, and. Parataxis. Hypotaxis is subordination. When we go into chapter 2, the rhythm changes, the style changes. In the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens, when no plant of the field had yet sprung up, then the Lord God planted. It's not and, although there are plenty of ands in this strand of Scripture. Covered a lot of ground here. Do you know where this is? You recognize this? One of my favorite places in Oregon. Similar. Clarno. It's part of the John Day fossil beds. It's Clarno in the John Day Valley. We were there about a month ago. I just love that landscape, and I think that's a very beautiful picture. And the fossil beds are where they've discovered, back in the 19th century, fossils that go back not to dinosaurs, they might be dinosaurs there, but to ancient mammals. And there are also leaves and trees and bark and so on. But there were saber-toothed tigers. This is about 44 million years ago. Saber-toothed tigers, rhinoceroses, small horses, kind of bear-wolf combinations and so on. Have you ever been there, anybody? There's Clarno, and then there's Sheeprock, and then there's the Painted Hills. Yeah, it's just really beautiful. Well, what's interesting about this is that they were discovered by this man, Thomas Condon. Very good look. I was thinking of growing a beard like that. This is from an OPB series, film that was made about him called A Faith in Fossils. He discovered these. And he was a congregational minister. He was born in Ireland in the early 19th century, came to Oregon around the time of the Civil War, 1862. He became the first Oregon state geologist for the state of Oregon, and eventually he was a famous professor at the University of Oregon. And here's what he said about those fossils. Now again, I'm not trying to tell you that you should have this attitude. I'm not saying this at all. There are very smart people in this room who will get A's in this class if they, come to class and occasionally come in my office and say flattering things to me and so on, that will not necessarily think this is true, who make other assumptions. There's an assumption that Christianity and Judaism are intrinsically opposed to science, and that fails to understand history. literal interpretation is relatively recent. Here's what Thomas Condon says. The hills from which these evidences were taken were made by the same God who made the hills of Judea, and the evidences are as authoritative. The church has nothing to fear from the uncovering of truth. Evolution was simply God's method of working and therefore not atheistic or infidel. It was the same in England. There's somebody named John Henry Newman. In 1912, there was a presidential election. Speaking of presidential elections. And there were 4 candidates. There was the sitting president, William Howard Taft. There was the former president, Teddy Roosevelt, who was running as part of the Bull Moose Party. There was Woodrow Wilson, the Democrat, who eventually became president. And then there was Eugene Debs, who was a socialist. Now, I'm not sure about Debs, but I know that all 3 of the major candidates, Roosevelt, Wilson, and Taft, were all public Christians and all had absolutely no problem with the theory of evolution, none. So things have happened. I'm not saying it's wrong to have problems with the theory of evolution, not at all. Not at all. In a way, what I'm saying, if I were to ask you to write a 10-page paper right now, between now and next class period, which I'm not going to, I'd say, well, write a 10-page paper about what assumptions about genre, somebody who thinks the Genesis stories are opposed to science, what assumptions that person is making about genre, about how this story is intended to be read and why, and about what counts as truth. And are there other possible assumptions? Now, you can make the assumption that the only thing that counts for truth is historical scientific truth, and that none of that can be found in the Bible, and therefore the Bible is all ridiculous. I mean, in a way, that kind of argument between certain kinds of atheists and certain kinds of believers makes the same assumption about genre. It's intended to be read as history. We have to evaluate it in those terms. It doesn't stand up, therefore, forget it. Or you can do what this other strand talks about and what the Bibleist literature assumes. What my own tradition assumes, that there are lots of different truths. There are other myths in the Western tradition, Greco-Roman. I mean, one of the things about this myth, right, the myth of Scripture in Genesis, is that there once was perfection and it was created by God. And then the next question is, well, why did it get messed up? And is it true that things are messed up? Would anybody deny the truth? Is the Bible true? Yeah, things are messed up, I think. Things are complicated. Maybe you would deny that. But anyway, I think the Bible is profoundly true in all kinds of ways. But the assumption is there was a perfect world created by God, and then it fell apart. That's not the assumption of the Greco-Roman myths, the creation myths. For one thing, God didn't create the world created God. These myths are not in one place in Greek mythology, they're in different places, but the idea is that there was chaos, and it somehow gave birth to Gaia and to heaven. They produced the gods. And out of chaos, but into chaos. Chaos always exists. And then the gods, who are very powerful but not all powerful, create human beings. But why are there one of the big questions, in fact, the big question in all of literature and in the Bible's literatures, why do bad things happen? Why do bad things happen? And in the Greco-Roman stories, you might know in the Iliad, Brad Pitt is chasing, what's his name, around the walls of Troy, chasing Hector, who played Hector? Christian Bale? No. Anyways, chasing whoever it is. And Zeus holds out a scale, and the scale falls this way. And that's why Hector dies. Zeus doesn't decide it. The gods can decide all kinds of things, but there's something stronger than the gods. It's just chance. It is excrement occurs. Why do bad things happen? Because it's random. That's the theory. That's one of the implications of a lot of these Greco-Roman myths. What's the implication of this myth? Most scholars think, well, originally there was this goodness, and human beings were made in the image and likeness of God, and there was harmony, and then things went bad. Why? So it changes. So, takeaway for today. Lots of different kinds of writing in the Bible. that having assumptions about kinds of writing determines the questions we ask. There are a lot of different ways to think about that. The way we're thinking about is pushing us to look at themes and pushing us to look at style, with the assumption that this is profoundly true, at least in the sense of spiritual truths, with all respect for everybody else. Put that on a Scantron exam. Well, I'll put it on a Scantron exam and you can give it back to me. All right.
You want us to turn that down?